Last week, a mainstream Australian news program aired an investigation that they titled ADHD Explosion. Like many of the stories that circle around mainstream media, here's what had me concerned. The conversation was framed entirely as a debate. Medication versus lifestyle, real ADHD versus attention seeking. Women accessing diagnosis versus an industry finding new markets to exploit. Binary framing that misses the complexity and nuance of people navigating real experiences. In response, and in time for ADHD Awareness Month, I've partnered up with my good friends at MVP Studios for a right to reply and a call to action driven by our community. Because when it comes to commenting on our experience, it's time to reclaim the rhetoric. I'm Mariane Power. I spent 17 years in the clinic supporting families and adults, first as a therapist and then as a clinical psychologist specialising in neurodevelopmental assessment and support. I navigated my own late diagnosis at 38, and now I work with neurodivergent leaders, from entrepreneurs to Fortune 500 companies, sharing the evidence, practical application, and measurable benefits for people and business that come when we design for difference. So here's why I'm recording this today. In science, when research needs challenge, we write response papers. We bring evidence, we consult communities, and we invite debate. Well, I'm asking mainstream media to do the same, especially when covering marginalised populations. Not because journalists are bad at their jobs, quite the opposite, but because the stakes for this, they're too high to get it wrong. Media holds significant power to shape dialogue, which is exactly why getting this conversation right, it matters. So in the link below, you're going to find every study that I reference, because I'm a scientist, and that's how we do this. Let's dive in. Here's what I need you to understand. The sensational debate about whether ADHD is real misses the point. The golden question that no one is asking is, why do the systems that we've built make it so hard for different and brilliant minds to execute? Because that brilliance, that's the part that doesn't seem to be making the mainstream coverage. Now, I can give you a gazillion anecdotal stories and point you to people doing incredible things on the internet search, but you can do that too. So let's elevate this conversation into what the research actually says. When scientists studied the Defence Forces investigating conditions for peak performance in combat conditions, they looked at commanders, some with ADHD and others without, in high-stress situations. With the right support, guess what? The ADHD commanders outperformed their non-ADHD peers, not despite having ADHD, but because of how our brains process pressure. Another study investigated 206 adults with ADHD to better understand unique strengths, and the findings were consistent. Creativity, flexibility, thinking on their feet, and seeing patterns that no one else sees. Multiple studies show people with ADHD are more likely to start a business, to take an entrepreneurial path, to excel when the stakes are high and the rules are unclear. Now, this isn't me selling you ADHD is a superpower. I personally hate that narrative. It's reductive and ignores the real struggles. But it's also not ADHD as a deficit that needs fixing. The truth? ADHD is a different operating system. And some environments are excelling at setting up the right conditions to mean that people like us in systems like that thrive. That's the conversation that we're not having because we're stuck debating whether it's real, while the evidence shows, oh yeah, it's real, it's genetic, and under the right conditions, our brains and nervous systems sense and do things that other brains find really hard. So when that particular news piece showed rising diagnostic rates and called it an explosion, they missed the actual story. And given there was a high focus on late diagnosed women, and I happen to be one of them, how about we take a closer look at those statistics? The story highlighted the rise in diagnoses amongst women in Australia in particular, citing stats that rates today have tripled since 2020. But numbers in isolation kind of mean nothing. Instead of exploring how rigorous science has since discovered that an entire generation of women were missed because diagnostic protocol at the time was wrapped around male samples, the angle for this story, like many others, was very clear, that this is a fad, women seeking attention, or an industry made up of big pharma and coaches taking unconventional approaches, exploiting Markets. Let me tell you what actually happened between 2020 and 2024. We were hot flushed, frazzled, and finally finding language for what we'd been living our entire lives. Let's break that down. Hot flushed, I'm 43. Many women getting diagnosed are in perimenopause or menopause. Now, when estrogen drops, ADHD features amplify. The coping mechanisms I'd built over decades, they suddenly stopped working. Frazzled. COVID didn't just stress everyone equally. It stripped away every invisible accommodation that we had built. Remote work, plus homeschooling, plus holding families together, scaffolding gone. Finding language. When I took my kids for assessment, I saw myself in every single question because ADHD is genetic. It runs in families and often down the maternal line. So here's the thing. Women started talking to each other on social media, in founder groups, in creative spaces. We recognized ourselves in one another. Is that an industry taking advantage of a trend? Or is that a community reclaiming our right to live whole and confident lives? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like grassroots recognition that medical and education systems have missed us for decades. So when Dr. Martin Whiteley says that the ADHD industry is finding target markets to exploit, that's not what happened. What happened was community. Women who'd been told their entire lives that we were too much or not enough finally got an explanation that made sense. We learned that decades of trying harder wasn't personal failure. It was showing up with grit, resilience, and sheer determination, with brain-based differences that, quite frankly, our world didn't largely accommodate for. We got to shed the shame-loaded labels with the truth that we were wired differently. So here's my invitation to Dr. Whiteley. I'd welcome a rigorous academic debate. Let's bring the research. Let's include the neurodivergent community, and let's do this the way that science is supposed to work. I'm not saying, to be clear, that skeptical voices shouldn't be included. Quite the contrary. I'm saying that before you platform someone making claims about vulnerable populations, please ask the right questions. Like, where's the evidence? Who did you consult? What does the current research actually say? That's responsible journalism. Because to be clear, when people serving as politicians in Australia are handed a microphone to call ADHD diagnosis and treatment a branding exercise without offering alternative solutions backed by evidence or community consultation, they're not protecting anybody. They're perpetuating harm that's kept us silent for decades. But we're done with that because we're so much more than that. Because here's what's possible when we get it right. Let's take a look at what happens when we design systems differently. This is where the actual media story did get things right. They amplified a beautiful neuro-inclusive school founded by late diagnosed ADHDer himself, Marco Renai, and featured Sashay Fox, also ADHD, a teacher, who talked about creating a culture where kids and teachers could name their struggles without judgment, where psychological safety means that you don't spend cognitive energy hiding, you spend it learning. And the young men featured in that story, they shone. You could see the impact of this school. That's what neuro-inclusive design looks like. And here's why it matters. Because those environments don't just help neurodivergent people. It turns out they help everybody. When you design systems that work for different brains instead of against them, two things happen. First, and most importantly, people get to live healthier, fuller, richer lives, and they get to show up as themselves. They get access to the education, the work, the community participation that they deserve, not as a charity, but as a basic, equitable human right. In Australia, we have no excuse not to provide this. We have the resources. We have the research. What we're missing is the will to challenge old stories and outdated policies that keep our systems stagnant. Second, and this is the part that organisations are starting to recognise, which is really exciting, the outcomes are significant. Let me be really clear about what the neuroscience research shows, especially about ADHD brains. In all brains, we have a region called the default mode network. Scott Barry Kaufman calls this the imagination network, which I really like. It's a part that generates ideas, it spots patterns, it makes unexpected connections. Those who are interested in driving innovation are especially interested in how to tune into this part of the brain. Now, for most people, that network turns on during rest. Think of those aha moments in the shower, right? Long drives, bushwalks. But for ADHDers, it's on all the time. Ideas, 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 ideas. Which sounds chaotic, and to be honest, it sometimes is. The incredible frustration of having so many ideas and struggling to then actually execute any of them without the right support because our differences lie in our executive function, that's real. But here's what else that persistent imagination network does. When we find work that we care about, challenges that matter, environments with enough stimulation, we can access something called flow and hyperfocus. Hours disappear. The rest of the world fades and we're completely absorbed. And not because we're trying, but because our brains are wired for this. Neuroscience research is showing that ADHD brains are wired for this. We have specific neuroelectric patterns like theta and alpha waves that make accessing these deep focused states more natural than for other neurotypical brains. When the challenge matches the interest, we lock in. And we perform at levels of focus that surprise even us. Organizations that understand this are seeing real results. Companies like JP Morgan Chase, SAP, Microsoft report productivity gains of 90 to 140% from neurodivergent employees when properly supported. And teams with cognitive diversity generate 19% higher innovation revenue. Retention rates jump by 90% when people feel valued. Surprising, right? But here's what really matters. Those outcomes aren't the reason to do this. The point is human dignity, the right to education, to work, to community, not as an accommodation, but as that baseline equity. The business benefits? Well, they're evidence that when you remove the barriers and design for difference, everybody wins. And by the way, this doesn't require a massive budget. It requires asking one human-centric question. What do you need to show up and do your best? Then actually listening and acting. Autonomy over how the work gets done. Time for uninterrupted focus. Clear feedback loops. Work that connects to purpose and not just process. These conditions are especially important for neurodivergent people, and they're good for all. So more than accommodations, this is what we know now from neuroscience that every brain actually needs for that deep, innovative work. But most workplaces aren't designed this way. Which brings me to the massive gap in this particular story, which was left wide open and the one that gave me the fire in the belly to speak up. Professor Giovanacci closed by saying that people need to look for explanations in their social circumstances and be supported through that process and your feelings validated rather than medicated. Beautiful sentiment. And in theory, I agree with parts. So does the research, but where's the roadmap? Because I need someone to explain to me. If not medication, then what? If the problem is social circumstances, then what systems are we actively actually changing? And if feelings need validation, then who's providing that? And how? Because as a former clinical psychologist, I can tell you that we were not trained on neuro-inclusive support for adults. That change is only now coming into the code, which leaves ADHD coaches that this story, without actually understanding the rigor behind the protocols in place, positioned as an unconventional approach. The school doing neuro-inclusive design right? Absolutely fantastic. And also one of maybe a handful in Australia. I'm a mum to 2 teens who hit burnout in traditional schools. Soon after, we became a part of that 39% of Australian families in our school can't community. Not because we didn't want to be at school, but because we couldn't. That's not a small number. And so I can confidently say that while things are changing, those environments don't exist for all, not yet. And workplaces? Most neurodivergent employees don't disclose. Not from shame, but because they perceive that it's not safe and there are real risks on the table. Workplaces punish what makes ADHD brilliant. Hyperfocus becomes poor time management when you miss meetings. Pattern recognition becomes off-topic. Direct communication? Unprofessional. Traditional workplace structures actively prevent the very conditions that unlock neurodivergent potential. Constant interruptions, back-to-back meetings that fragment focus, arbitrary deadlines that ignore natural working rhythms, open plan offices with sensory overload, tasks chosen for us and not by us as people with incredible interest-based nervous systems. So when someone says seek support in your environment, Which environment? The one where people hide their neurodivergence so that they can keep their jobs and feed their families? Where burnout is the norm? When somebody says seek support in your social circumstances, I need to know, are you funding neuro-inclusive schools at scale? Are you redesigning workplace systems? Are you training managers in neurodiversity affirming practices? Because all of these things are available. Creating the community support, perhaps, the structures that people actually need. Or are you just telling people that they're not broken while leaving them in systems designed to break them instead? Because here's what I see. The ADHD community, the one being called an industry, is actually building that infrastructure that doesn't exist anywhere else. Coaches, creators, community builders, and systems designers. Yep, some make money. Good. Wish I did. Because for far too long, the only options were to take medication and hope or suffer alone. And on the topic of medication, actually, let's stop there because this is the one that the media loves to push. And here's the conversation that we're not having, and we should be. I've been on both sides of the prescription pad, right? So I've been the clinician writing the recommendations to put forward to the psychiatrist, and I've supported my children through their choices. I take stimulant medication myself. I've seen firsthand what the evidence clearly captures that medication can, when it's right, transform lives. I've sat across from kids and adults who describe medication as finally being able to hear and action my own thoughts, or like someone's just turned down the volume on my brain and I can actually get things done. Are there external benefits when kids take medication like this story positioned? Sometimes, yes. Teachers appreciate calmer classrooms and parents appreciate fewer meltdowns at home, but guess what? Those kids, where medication works, they do too. So suggesting that children themselves don't benefit from medication, that dismisses the lived experience of millions of people. Medication isn't perfect, and it's definitely not for everybody. Side effects are real, and it should never be the only intervention. But here's the thing, contrary to what the skeptics have sold us as a story, that medication is the first line of defense, as if ADHD is some kind of war on humanity, the gold standard support pathway actually isn't medication alone. It's medication, plus therapy, plus evidence-based coaching, and work-life design that works with your brain. But presenting medication as either a miracle cure or a dangerous drug is exactly the binary thinking that's keeping us stuck. Because the real question is, why are we still arguing about individual medical decisions when we should be redesigning the systems that make those decisions feel so high stake in the first place? So here's a challenge. And here's what needs to change. When you're consuming content about ADHD and neurodivergence in general, whether it's mainstream media, social media, or academic research, I want you to ask yourself these three questions. Where is the lived experience? Where is the research? And am I a part of the solution or reinforcing the problem that we've been up against for years? Because that news piece featured a psychiatrist that I followed when I was first learning about my own diagnosis. Dr. Sasha went online to combat the misinformation that was on TikTok at the time. She's got a medical degree, clinical experience. She helps hundreds of families. Yet they called her an influencer, while other voices with no clear clinical background or evidence of where they've shared their information from, they were called research and experts. Now, that's the rhetoric that we're reclaiming. Because here's what I know about the future. The future is building ecosystems where we radically accept differences and design to pull out the best in one another. Designing systems from the ground up where hyperfocus is leveraged, time blindness supported, non-linear thinking drives innovation, energy fluctuations are planned for, and communication styles are diverse. Because the same brain that experiences traditional work structures as torture is often the same brain that sees solutions that others miss, that thinks in systems, that obsesses over problems until they're solved, especially when they matter. We don't need to be fixed. We need our systems designed for how we actually work. Reclaim Our Rhetoric isn't just a response to one news piece. It's a movement. I'm having conversations with people building businesses, leading teams, creating real change that counts, because they've designed systems that work with their brains and not against them. The first conversation drops soon, So watch this space. Because the neurodivergent community, we're not an industry. We're the ones building what doesn't exist. We're providing the roadmap that nobody else gave us. It's time to reclaim the rhetoric.